Friends, we're going to give it about 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Do we have enough chairs out? Everybody have a chair? I suppose so. All right. All right, if everybody would grab your seats. Elizabeth Weaver is going to open us with a song that is especially important to me, and I hope that you will listen closely to the words.
I don't know if Chris is ready. Good. I don't know if you can hear me, or if you're even there. I don't know if you would listen to a humble prayer. I pray for light in the darkness, that love would lead us through. Still I see your face and wonder, were you once an outcast too? God help the outcasts hungry from birth. Show them the mercy they don't find on earth. The lost and forgotten, they look to you still. God help the outcasts when nobody will. I ask for nothing, I can get by, but I know so many less lucky than I. God help the outcast, the poor and downtrodden. I thought we all were the children of God. I don't know if there's a reason why some are blessed, some not. Why the few you seem to favor, they fear them, flee them, try not to see them. God help the outcasts, the tired, the torn, seeking an answer to why they were born. Winds of misfortune have blown them about. You made the outcasts, don't cast them out. Poor and unlucky, the weak and the odd. I thought we all were the children of God. I thought we all were the children of God.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Please join me in prayer. You, Creator God, Ancient of Days, in the midst of cruel chaos, we yearn for order of creation. The song echoes our hope, perhaps also our uncertainty, But today we come to gain hope, which is hard to come by these days when it is difficult to envision a future where mercy and justice rule. I struggle when I see the images of dead children in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan, when I hear about ICE raids and new detention centers that are being built, about politicians boasting about dehumanizing immigrants and the vicious grasp for self-serving power. God of deliverance and giver of peace, heal the brokenhearted, set the captives free, help your people, the downtrodden, your children. Help us today to grasp hope, to live with hope, to envision and enact a future that is just and right and serves your people. Call upon us today. Amen.
Elizabeth will be back with us later for another piece. My name is Grady Throneberry. I have the privilege of chairing the lecture committee. Our other members are Frank, who just offered prayer. Eileen Bartlett is here somewhere. Eileen Bartlett, Melanie Claypool, and Margaret Graves is back in the back. I guess they're all shy because nobody's standing up, but they are here. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Restrooms are out this door. In the event that we should have some sort of emergency, which is highly unlikely, that door, there's also a door at the back of the kitchen. We've never had one, but as sure as I don't tell you, we will. We will break for about 45 minutes after Dr. Sanders presents. We'll have folks that will direct you to our Birchwood lobby, which is where you'll find snacks and beverages, books from our speakers for sale, and they'll be there for some book signing. And then we'll let you know when it's about time to come back here. That will probably be around 3:30 or 3:45. We have an all-star panel for you today in addition to our keynote speaker. You will be impressed, and you will be, as they say in Southern Baptist circles, you're going to be blessed. Friends, there's an old proverb of unknown origin that says, may you live in interesting times. It's been used as both a blessing and a curse, but we certainly do live in interesting times. The Johnson Lecture Series is named in honor of Reverend William H. Johnson, who served Crescent Hill Baptist Church for nearly 40 years as Minister of Education. It began with an anonymous gift of $10,000 about 17 years ago, and it's been self-sustaining ever since. Our topics and speakers have included climate change, LGBTQ inclusion, sexual abuse, and among the speakers that we have had is Wendell Berry. We did a tribute to Dr. John Claypool, who some of you will know, as well as Dr. Glenn Henson. In recent years, the series has centered on the intersection of faith, culture, and politics, which is often difficult to navigate. It's been most often attended by critical thinkers, such as you all, with interest in that intersection. Last year, in the run-up to the election, we hosted Dr. David Gushee, and his topic was defending democracy from its Christian enemies. This year, in the aftermath of the election, we welcome Reverend Dr. Cody Sanders, presenting hope in an age of cruelty and despair. You can see how this worked. Reverend Sanders, Dr. Sanders, is Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care Leadership at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is the author of several books, most recently spiritual care first aid, and all hands-on approach for church and community. Prior to joining the faculty of Luther, Cody was pastor of Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a chaplain at both Harvard and MIT. He and his partner, also named Cody, live in St. Paul. Please welcome Dr. Cody Sanders as he brings, well, it seems like he already brought it.
Thank you, Grady and committee, for inviting me here. I want to note up front that I did wear a jacket, but I was told by a self-described mature adult that I didn't have to wear it when she found out I was coming from Minnesota, where we had temperatures in the 70s last week. So thank you for that permission. And it's an honor to be here at Crescent Hill, because while I've never been here before, so many of the people who formed me in my life of ministry were formed by this congregation. I went to the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer in Atlanta, and so many of my professors spent formative years here. So I've heard about this place for a really, really long time, and it's good to be here with you this afternoon. And good to be with you to talk about a subject that is both vitally important and very dangerous. Hope, if preached and taught and spoken of poorly, can become one of the most theologically dangerous notions that I know, breeding complacency and compliance with the status quo and a quietism that entirely strays from the ways of Jesus. And preached and taught and spoken of well, hope can be a catalyst for some of the most robust and meaningful expressions of Christian faith practice that is possible, even when the world seems to be coming apart at the seams. My overarching theory is this, just in a sentence. Hope must be formed like faith, and hope must be tended like love. We cannot have hope as some sort of inner possession, but we can cultivate hope in a way that gives hope expression in practice. Having and not having hope produces shame when we come up short on hope. But forming and cultivating and tending and practicing hope turns us toward one another in community in order to forge uncertain pathways of possibility in life when life is at its limits. We have catechisms and curriculum for faith formation. Why not for hope? It's well past time that we can afford to let hope be a haphazard notion that means anything from wishful thinking, which sounds something like, well, it doesn't look good, but we just have to have hope that things will work out, to captivity to an ideology of progress, which sounds something like, don't worry too much, things are always getting better and everything will work out in the end, to spiritual escapism that disregards the entire witness of Holy Scripture of human involvement with God in the broken places of the world. And spiritual escapism sounds something more like, God's got this. We don't need to concern ourselves too much. We need to treat hope with the seriousness and rigor that we treat faith and love. These are Paul's big three: faith, hope, and love. Because we're moving into precarious times. And I don't have to explain those times to you. I decided in this lecture, which has cruelty and despair in the title, to spend less time describing the cruelty and despair, because I think you all know the cruelty that is going on around us. And many lives, both human and more than human. And when I use the term more than human, I'm speaking about the ecological web of life. The more than human web of life. Both human and more than human lives in the ecological sphere will depend on our communal abilities of hopeful practice in order to survive in the coming days. And while hope is often a vital concern when we're moving through individual hardship, like profound personal losses or difficult diagnosis, I want to frame hope today as a communal practice, not just an individual disposition. We practice our faith in community with others. Jesus never called solo disciples. He called people into communities of discipleship. We must be in communion with others in order to experience love. Thus, I believe hope is best cultivated and practiced within communities of others too. Multi-species and ecological communities. We must hope with all creation alongside the human communities we belong to, and in relationship with our communion with the triune God, who is always and ever God in community. So I want to start with this. This is sort of the prompting sphere of hope. I'm not going to spend too much time around this first ring at the core here, what I call the apocalyptic emotions, because I've lectured and written about these emotions elsewhere, including in the book that Grady mentioned, Spiritual Care First Aid, so you can read about that. If you want more on these apocalyptic emotions, email me. My email address will be at the end. I'll send you things about that. But they're important to acknowledge, not as the antithesis of hope, as some might initially suspect, but as the originating affective events that compel us toward a hope in practice. These three emotions, fear, sadness, and anger, which most evolutionary psychologists consider primary emotions, that is rooted in our biology, controlled by our subcortical regions of the brain, are important evolutionary gifts that serve vital survival functions for humans. They serve to direct our attention, influence our perception and cognition, focus our interests within our environment. And I term them apocalyptic emotions because whether we are confronted with what feels like the end of the world or even the end of the world as we know it, these emotions can be triggered in pervasive and unrelenting fashions by existential threats to our human and more than human survival. That's when I think they become apocalyptic, when the fear, anger, and sadness are triggered over and over and over and over and over again. They can become more than a signal about something or experience in our immediate surroundings, and they can begin to develop into feelings about our world, pervasive temperaments or moods. And each of these emotions, when they arise in our body minds or within the collective of our communities, hold important messages for us about how we're experiencing the world. These messages need to be attended to with care and often acted upon with intention so that the emotions don't elongate into long-term temperaments or moods or outlooks on life. So I'm going to go really quickly through fear, sadness, and anger because I want to do some new things around hope and not just kind of tell you this stuff that I've already been thinking about and writing about for a while. Fear, I suspect, is no stranger to you these days. If you are feeling fearful now and again, then you can certainly imagine the fear that is triggered in people and communities in other parts of the world, like Gaza or Ukraine or Myanmar or Sudan or Congo or immigrants in our own communities around the U.S. Use your fear experiences to gain some empathic entry into those lives. The central question that fear should raise for us when we experience it is, how is my well-being or that of my wider world of concern being put in danger? I imagine when you bring up the fearfulness that you feel with others, you don't often get met with an invitation to some conversation about what is arising that fear in your body-mind for you. You might get some like, yeah, I'm fearful too, or don't worry too much. But I'm encouraging you to really get into community with people to talk about what it is in your sphere of concern that is being threatened, put in danger. Fear can compel us into actions that help to protect what is in danger, the vulnerable who are under threat, the ecosystems that we belong to that are disappearing. But in a minute, I'll also talk about how fear can work against us when it elongates into a temperament or mood. Anger may be one of the most ubiquitous emotions publicly expressed in the U.S. today, and while anger may be stoked by some things that are entirely fabricated, We also may have very real reasons to be angry. The central question that anger should raise for us when we experience it is this: how are my values of justice, survival, and well-being and flourishing, and the survival, well-being, and flourishing of those that I love, both human and ecological kin, being threatened? Fear alerts us to threats. While it's unlikely that he ever actually said it, St. Augustine is often credited with the quote, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are." We'll get to courage later, but it's a nice quote, though he probably wasn't Augustine. But yeah, anger should prompt us toward some action in relation to what is threatening to us. It can prompt us to hopeful practice in the world, from acts of compassion for those being threatened to movements of justice, addressing threats to the values of equality, mutual flourishing, ecological concern, etc. Now, sadness, the central question here is, what important parts of my world feel like they are being lost or irreparably damaged? Deeply feeling this sadness is important to stave off the numbness of the suffering of others, becoming numb to the suffering we see. We need to attend to sadness with care, in community with others. And while fear, anger, and sadness are gifts to us and hold important messages about our life in the world, left unattended, that is, left without a community of care to come around us in these experiences of fear, sadness, and anger, they can develop into longer-term temperaments and moods and outlooks on life that diminish our capacity for hopeful action. The emotions themselves do not diminish our capacity for hopeful action, but left unattended, uncared for, they can. And a compounding issue is that we are constantly engaged in the social media sphere that is continually pressing our fear, anger, and sadness buttons over and over and over again on a never-ending loop. So there's a good chance, if we aren't bringing these things into communion with others, into communication with others, that they can develop into longer-term temperaments and moods for us. We can color our entire perception of the world with the lens of anger or of fear. So let's look at what that might do for us. Fear, when left unattended, such that it becomes a pervasive mood or outlook on life, leads to helplessness, apathy, immobilization, withdrawal from others into isolation. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han says it this way: with fear, depression takes hold. Fear and resentment drive people into the arms of the right-wing populists. They breed hate. Solidarity, friendliness, and empathy are eroded. Growing fear and resentment make society more brutal and ultimately threaten democracy. In a climate of fear, people worry about repression and so do not dare to voice their opinions freely. We even fear thinking. A climate of fear produces a continuation of the same. Conformism spreads. Fear blocks the paths toward the other. Anger, when left to fester and elongate into an outlook on life, as it has now for so many of our neighbors, develops into resentment, cynicism that drives us apart from one another, the us-them thinking of our current polarization, and even into a posture of vengefulness toward those we imagine as our enemies. Sadness, elongated into a temperament or outlook on life, can cultivate a loss of meaning, a feeling of numbness to the pain of the world, the extreme fatigue that exhausts us before we are ever able to mobilize in response to the provocations of the sadness that we encounter. So I wonder how many of you would say, that you feel some combination of fear, anger, or sadness at least 3 times a week. Well, some of you are doing pretty well not to. And I want to ask you really to reflect on this. Do you have communities that you can bring that fear, anger, and sadness into conversation with others who will take it seriously, who will talk with you about it and about their fear, anger, and sadness, and who will move into the possibilities that fear, anger, and sadness are prompting for you in your action in the world? If you feel these things, quite frequently. It means you're alive and you're awake to the pain of the world. And that is where the prompting toward hopeful action begins, feeling the fear and anger and sadness when they come, listening to their messages, learning to hold those apocalyptic emotions with a community of concern. They are not the antithesis of hope. They are where I think hope actually starts to grow, to become possible. I'll get to that more. I want to talk about this next little circle here that I call the transimminent emotions, and this is what I think orients us in our cultivation of hope. Fear, anger, and sadness prompt us toward hopeful praxis. The gratitude, wonder, and grief orient us toward possibilities of hopeful cultivation. It's important that we don't see these emotional experiences as antidotes to this inner circle of fear, anger, and sadness. Those are important emotional experiences. They carry vital messages that we should attend to with care. These three transimminent emotional experiences are not antidotes, but intentional additions to the apocalyptic emotions that are so pervasively triggered in times when the world as we know it feels like it is coming to an end. And I call them transimminent because I see them as serving both the functions of transcendence. These emotional experiences open us outward to the world beyond our individual selves. They even open us outward toward an ultimate context or to God. As well as imminent, they help us to relate differently to the human and more than human world that is immediately present to us in our context or environment. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this ring because you can read about this stuff in Spiritual Care First Aid, but I think it's important to mention, especially for our churches, to recognize that it is our gift and one of our most unique roles in people's lives to cultivate spaces for gratitude and grief and wonder. I'd say that these three complex emotional experiences are some of the clearest emotions we observe in, for example, the Psalms. All the while, many of the Psalms were also expressing fear and anger and sadness that resulted for the community during the Babylonian exile. Here's some examples. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into God's presence with singing. Enter God's gates with thanksgiving. That's Psalm 100. Cultivating expressions of gratitude, even when the world feels that it's involve asking questions like this. What feels like a gift in my life that it elicits my opening out toward the world or the people around me? How are these gifts moving me toward giving of myself and my gifts to others? Grief, this is one of the most profound expressions of grief, probably in any written language. By the rivers of Babylon. This is during the exile here. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Psalm 137. In order to cultivate expressions of grief, we must ask questions like this. What losses do I need to more intentionally mourn and lament? Who can share with me in this important grief work? How do we give expression musically, artistically, liturgically, ritually, communally to the deep pain of losing people and places and values that we love and cherish? Then finally, wonder. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Psalm 19. Perhaps no greater expression of wonder and awe and the mystery of the cosmos anywhere. To cultivate wonder, we ask questions like this. What is evoking my sense of awe, curiosity, or deep interest in the world around me? Wonder opens us outward toward others and toward the world in curiosity, in engagement. How are these experiences luring me out of myself and into engagement with the wider world? And gratitude, grief, and wonder each invite us to consider how we cultivate these emotional experiences in our communal lives. Ritual, music, art, the posture and movement of our bodies, food, communal relationships with beings in the ecological landscape. Listen, if you're a minister or lay leader in a congregation, we should not leave gratitude, grief, and wonder to chance. When we sit down for worship planning or religious education planning or engagement with the world around us, with our congregations, we should intentionally think, how is this experience going to hold the grief that these people are holding in their hearts about Gaza, about Ukraine, about climate collapse, et cetera, et cetera. How is the liturgical expression we're about to give to our worship opening people toward wonder? This is how we hold grief, anger, or rather anger, fear, and sadness with some more complex communal emotions so that they don't elongate into temperaments and moods that color our view of the world. All right, now we're going to move into hope. This is where I wanted us to spend the most time. The mobilizing ring of this hope wheel or spiral. The 6 parts of the hope wheel are intended to be engaged as a non-linear process, meaning that there is no stop and start here, but a cyclical engagement. And you can start with the most available resource you have, once you see what the 6 are, and go from there. I'm going to start with this piece, what I call realistic appraisal. You can think of these as sort of ingredients of hope, each one needing our attention. If I had to boil this piece down to a few words or phrases, they'd be: keep your eyes open, looking at the world as it is, not as it once was or as you wish it would be, putting the pieces together, taking in helpful, critical, long-form commentary on the issues that beset us, refusing to look away or escape with wishful thinking or fatalism. Either the fatalism of the optimistic variety, which says, don't worry, it'll all work out. That's fatalism. It's just optimistic fatalism. Or the pessimistic variety of fatalism that says, we're doomed and there's nothing we can do about it, so we might as well not do anything. Both of those are fatalistic. And what a realistic appraisal asks of us is to look clearly at what is happening in the world and not slide into either optimism or pessimism that produces fatalism. There are at least 4 things that hinder us from making a realistic appraisal of the situations we face within Christian communities. One is fear. As described by a pastor that I recently interviewed for some research that I'm doing, this pastor said these words to me: I never used to worry about standing up in the front and preaching. I've been doing it since I was 16 or 17 years old, and it never used to scare me. In the last 10 years or so, it makes me nervous to do it, to get up there and to be vulnerable and open with what I think and my beliefs on all this stuff, and to not worry about losing every person in my congregation, or worse. Pastors are concerned about congregations' reactions to hearing realities spoken of in the pulpit. Not opinions about realities, but just realities named in the pulpit. Lay people are also concerned about polarization among their friend groups that keep them in silence about a realistic appraisal of what's happening in the world around us. Second thing that hinders us is our fear of discouraging others into despair with a realistic appraisal of the dire nature of the situations we face. But I want to posit up front, and this is really important to this whole theory, that despair is not the antithesis of hope. Theologian Yara Gonzalez Justiano says this in her wonderful book that I'll recommend later. I'll show it to you toward the end. She says, hope allows space for hopelessness. Another theologian, Cody J, claims despair as a precondition of hope that leads to activism. A sentiment echoed by, again, philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who says, only in the deepest despair does true hope arise. The deeper the despair, the more intense the hope. Or Duke religion professor, whose book I also recommend to you, Joseph Winters, he claims this. He says, quote, "As human desire for coherence and harmony weaken people's ability to engage facets of life, history, and human experience that are disturbing and uncomfortable," he says we need a hope that is tethered to the difficult practice of mourning. Get there later. This is what Winter calls, in the title of his profound book, Hope Draped in Black. This would be, he says, a hope that is not divorced from shame and melancholy, but enabled by these affects and dispositions. In fact, hope would involve the capacity to be figuratively wounded, undone, and transformed by the violence and suffering that selves are always implicated in, particularly the violence that sustains racial and national formations. So if you didn't get all of those pieces from Winters and Day and Gonzalez Yustiano, just hear this. Despair is not the antithesis of hope. Despair can be the place from which hope is born, is cultivated. Third factor keeping us from a realistic appraisal of the situations we face is the all-out assault on the information that we have available to us in the forms of misinformation, intentional disinformation, AI hallucinations of made-up information, deep fakes that are really hard for most people to discern as fake. Like in the last month, my social media feed has just exploded with what I can clearly see as AI-generated images, but that the people posting them don't know are AI-generated images that come with little stories. And they're not, fear-inducing stories or anger-inducing stories. Actually, many of them are quite nice and hopeful, but clearly the image that they're based on is an AI-generated image. It's such a critical part of the picture now that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has started to take this into account in their assessment of the nuclear threat and of climate collapse. They say that both nuclear threat and climate collapse are now compounded by cyber-enabled information warfare that undercuts society's ability to respond. It's harder and harder to simply know and communicate the facts of the matter when the facts, including good journalism, are a threat to the powerful. The fourth factor hindering realistic appraisal is our tendency to get caught up in a never-ending cycle of critique that moves beyond diagnosis. Theologian Marika Rose says, "Critique can be a way of sustaining our relation to the things that we criticize. As long as we're putting our energy into critique, then we are not putting our energy into other things." And this is a really great book I'd recommend to you that moves into realistic appraisal of not only our contemporary context, but how the Christian tradition has given rise to some of the most problematic pieces of our contemporary context. And listen, I know many good preachers at peace and justice-oriented congregations who diagnose the problems that we face endlessly from the pulpit, week in and week out, but never help the church move beyond critique. We have to get over our need to be right and to prove our point of view, and instead focus on being effective toward our highest aspirations and sense of call, which should be helping other people survive the end of the world. The world is always ending for someone. Political scientist, professor, human rights attorney Kate Cronin Furman wrote in a New York Times piece a few years ago about what she called the mass atrocity at the U.S.-Mexico border, that I would say is even worse today than when she wrote this article several years ago. And she harkens back to an earlier period of mass atrocity for lessons we might learn. This is a lesson in, I think, illustration of a realistic appraisal. I want to illustrate each of these 6 pieces of this hope wheel with some vignette. Here's one. In Denmark during World War II, she says, strong social pressure, including from the churches, contributed to the refusal of the country to comply with Nazi orders to deport its Jewish citizens. This was not pressure from politicians at the top, but pressure on the foot soldiers, the bureaucratic middlemen who experienced the social pressure of their neighbors to stop participating in the work that they were undertaking, not as a matter of strong ideology, but just as their 9-to-5 job. When the Nazis revealed their plan to deport the entire Jewish population of Denmark, the leaders of the Danish church sent an open letter to German officials that was read from every pulpit in the nation on October 3rd, 1943. This is a paragraph from that letter, read from every pulpit. Wherever Jews are persecuted because of their religion or race, it is the duty of the Christian church to protest against such persecution because it is in conflict with the sense of justice inherent in the Danish people and inseparable from our Danish Christian culture through the centuries. We understand religious freedom as the right to exercise our worship of God as our vocation and conscience bid us, and in such a manner that race and religion per se can never justify that a person be deprived of his rights, freedom, or property. Our different religious views notwithstanding, we shall fight for the cause that our Jewish brothers and sisters may preserve the same freedom which we ourselves evaluate more highly than life itself. Then the churches collaborated to hide their Jewish neighbors until they could evacuate to nearby Sweden. It was an effort organized by hundreds of private citizens working together and collecting funds for the effort. On the night of the rescue effort, all of the German patrol ships in the area were docked for repairs because the Danes had bribed the Nazi soldiers so that they could make their escape on the boats of fishermen who were so poor that they could not afford to lose a day's wage. So they too were paid by this collection. And in the end, the Nazis were only successful in deporting 580 of Denmark's 7,000 Jews. They didn't wait. Here's the piece about realistic appraisal. They didn't wait until the situation got so bad that it was almost too late to start acting. They were realistic in their appraisal of a dire situation. They saved their neighbors' lives and provided for their neighbors who were losing a day's wage to help in the rescue effort. Bound up in that story of a community acting out of a very realistic appraisal of their very dire situation that they communicated with clarity is the second piece of the hope wheel that I'm developing here. That is the courage to risk. To not look away is one of the hardest parts of cultivating our courage to risk. There is a never-ending stream of distraction in the palm of our hands at all times that we can turn to. To move toward the pain and broken places of the world requires not only our collective emotional fortitude, cultivated, I think, from gratitude, grief, and wonder, but it also requires our sustained attention that is ever ebbing away through social media curation of the attention economy. We know this. Social media is eroding our collective attention spans. So to be able to pay attention to the suffering of the world is not just about preserving our feelings because we need to look away. It's because we can't concentrate on anything long enough to look at it in a sustained fashion. Now, saying that your church is courageous is kind of meaningless, I think. It means nothing to say, to just say that you're courageous, unless you're also embodying that courage in solidarity with others whose backs are against the wall. And so I want to ask you, because I think you all belong to churches, if you belong to churches, that have these stories. What are the stories of your congregation risking something of its own life in order to stand in solidarity with people whose back is against the wall? Find times to tell those stories to one another, because they're stories we need to resurrect from the archives. If I had time, I'd tell you about this church I served in Cambridge which was practicing sanctuary in the first Trump administration, but only because they were practicing sanctuary back in the 80s and were infiltrated by the FBI and had an informant in the pews. And they knew that there was an informant, they just didn't know who it was. And every Sunday they would stand up and pray for their informant. And many of them risked prison, taking the woman who was in sanctuary around to other churches in secret to tell her story so that those churches could get involved in sanctuary too. I mean, these are stories of courage and risk that exist in your congregations, and we need to tell them. Do you mind if I do a little brief soapbox speech here? I debated on whether or not to say this, but I think it's important. I have become really weary of white liberals using the moniker of good trouble from John Lewis to describe things like their willingness to show up at rallies and protests or demonstrations, or to preach sermons from the safety of their sanctuaries about concerns of justice. And I went back to make sure I wasn't misremembering, because I was in the audience at one of these talks that John Lewis gave where he talked about getting into good trouble. And I was not misremembering. What Lewis was describing in his speeches about getting into good trouble, necessary trouble, was Rosa Parks engaging in nonviolent resistance after training at the Highlander School. It wasn't a mistake that she sat down and refused to give up her seat that day. This was strategy. What Lewis was talking about in those speeches was describing the inspiration of nonviolent resistance that they were getting from Gandhi. What Lewis was describing was Martin Luther King Jr.'s message that recruited Lewis and others into the movement that led to lunch counter sit-ins where they would get hot coffee poured on them, where they would get beaten at Greyhound bus stations, and Bloody Sunday, where they were beaten to bloody pulps. He was talking about getting arrested and going to jail 40 times. He was describing actions in which some of his friends did not make it and died. He was not talking about going to a protest or a rally that you got permits for, or putting up lawn signs that offend your neighbors in the HOA. To get into good trouble, you actually have to be putting yourself in a situation in which you might get into trouble. That's one of the two words. So let's stop whitewashing Lewis's words. And if we want to claim the term good trouble, because that is an inspiring speech, and I hope that it inspires us toward good trouble. But if we want to claim the term good trouble, let us embody Lewis's lived example and the example of those who inspired him to enter courageously into literally troublesome places. In their book, Pirate Care, Acts Against the Criminalization of Solidarity, Garzino, Mars, and Medak say, in a nutshell, transformational care justice in our time at least, is easier achieved by transgression than argumentation. Transgression is not only a reaction to unjust laws, but a strategy to create a momentum of collective subjectification, an awareness of the power we hold as a multitude of those subjected to various forms of illegalization. And we are seeing what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, the stripping away of the structures of society that people depend on. We are seeing the criminalization of care. We're in some cities providing places to live for homeless people in your church lawn or something like that is criminalized. It's not going to get better magically. Your acts of care are going to be soon enough, perhaps getting you into good trouble. And I want to tell you one of those stories. Starting in 1986, my friend Jim Matulski, who's there in the middle of this left-hand picture, spent 10 years as the pastor of the predominantly LGBTQ Metropolitan Community Church in the Castro of San Francisco. Throughout those years, his church became the de facto LGBTQ community center. The doors were always open for services, community meetings, weddings, funerals. Jim said, quote, "It was a protest every Friday night, which turned into a dance party." The church was growing and dying all at the same time, adding a second and third service each Sunday, and also holding multiple funerals every single week. About half of the city's 60,000 gay men had AIDS, and there was no effective treatment in these early years. Jim said they were dying and in great pain, and in some instances barely able to talk. Each and every person I talked to was convinced that they had brought this on themselves. They were worried about going to hell. Many of them were experiencing rejection from friends, family, and loved ones, including gay friends. Many of these men became untouchable in their communities. Everyone from family members to medical professionals to funeral directors, afraid to touch a man with AIDS. So the MCC Church began instituting the laying on of hands at communion. Anyone here been to an MCC church? Find one and check it out, because usually, in my experience, the MCC churches I've gone to, they still do this. And when you experience it, just know that it goes back to the early days of the AIDS epidemic. They, after the person receives the communion elements from one person, they go to the next minister or lay person, and the minister looks at them directly in the eyes when they serve them the elements of communion. And then the next person, with non-intrusive touch, using their name when possible, offered them a blessing that emphasized unconditional love. The communion table was the one place where they were not untouchable. He tells the story of one man he would visit in the hospital in his dying days who said, "Will you hold my hand and pray with me?" Which of course I did, Jim said. And he said that the only person who would hold his hands and pray with him was one of the nurses on the night shift, who always prayed that he would be delivered of his sin of homosexuality before he died. Jim said, by the time anyone realized AIDS was sexually transmitted, the damage was widespread. The disease could strike a fit, healthy young guy, and he'd be dead in months. Our moods became darker, our hope had dissipated, and I became a kind of nihilistic. My capacity to sustain an interior sense of self-preservation waned. We felt like our world was dying, and this is impossible to communicate to people who weren't there. The only treatments for HIV at the time required 36 pills a day, which weren't very effective, and they made you really sick. And marijuana was the only thing that helped some of the people with those painful side effects, suppressing the nausea so that they could eat and ease the pain a little. And the city government of San Francisco ignored the use of marijuana among the city's gay population dying of AIDS. But the California Attorney General, who had aspirations to become governor, closed all of the medical marijuana clubs almost overnight. They began cracking down on marijuana possession, seizing people's assets. This is, again, organized abandonment. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Jim was conflicted about whether the church should step into the situation to begin distributing marijuana to men dying of AIDS. He contacted Phyllis Nelson, a member of the church with a passion for justice, whose son Glenn and partner Rob had both died of AIDS. Phyllis said, "Of course we will pass out marijuana, and I'll stand right next to you." Jim said, "This was after my own HIV diagnosis. This was a change in me, facing my own mortality, and it made me realize we're only here as long as we're here. What are you being so cautious about?" My ministry changed right after that, he said. So in 1996, they began to give out pot to AIDS patients in the church right after communion and before the closing hymn. He said, "We had rules. No money could be exchanged. The pot had to be donated. People had to provide a note. We were promised by the supervisors and health department that the city would protect us as much as they could, that there would be no city prosecution, and they would try to protect us from the state and federal agents, which they couldn't guarantee." Jim said, "I took a risk. I used my body. I acted on a belief that was motivated by my desire to provide healing and comfort for my friends. And I didn't know what else to do that I could do, but this was something I could do, and I did it." And the risk was real, and the spiritual intensity was real, and the tangible relief for the people who used it was real. And he closes with these words, "Let your acts of love guide you, even if it means great risk. The greater love, the greater the risk, and you will never regret acts of great love." Another piece of the hope wheel that the MCC at large exemplified in this era was an anticipatory view of a church and a world that was otherwise than it currently was, nurturing your imagination for what Ashon Crawley calls otherwise possibilities, fuels hopeful orientation toward possibilities beyond the present status quo, and keeps us nimble for the practice of hope. Transgender sci-fi writer Charlie Jane Anders. Anybody read Anders' sci-fi work? Well, after this. Anders says this, "Visualizing a happier, more just world is a direct assault on the forces that are trying to break your heart." Visualizing a happier, more just world is a direct assault on the forces that are trying to break your heart. So whether that's through reading sci-fi writers like Anders or Octavia Butler or Kim Stanley Robinson, or by gathering every week regularly with people who are imagining possibilities beyond the status quo in churches or book groups or community organizing collectives, do whatever you can do to nurture your hopeful imaginations so as not to let the present status quo have the last word on what is possible in your life or in the world. And an important part of an anticipatory view that curtails the possibility of certainty, and certainty, by the way, is the enemy of hope, an enemy of hope at least. An important part of this anticipatory view that curtails certainty and the fatalism of optimism that says it'll be okay, don't worry, or the fatalism of pessimism that says it's all doomed, so don't worry, is to become comfortable with uncertainty. This is an important practice for communities of hopeful action. Gonzalez Justiano again argues a major strategy for control of the imagination is the endless production of objects of desire that entice you to want the next thing and the next, always at a cost. Imagination cannot compete with the overwhelming rate of production and its enchantment when even emotional experiences become marketable. When imagination is led to believe in an inevitable future, it becomes hopeless and purposeless. When imagination is led to believe in an inevitable future, it becomes hopeless and purposeless. So this, and maybe we'll talk about this some with Anna in the panel, this is what I think of as the not yet nature of the eschatological imagination. There's an openness, an uncertainty, and it's fundamental to an active, hopeful orientation to the world and the very real problems we face that summon us toward courage and risk. That the world could be otherwise, and we just might possibly get there, but no guarantees. Troy Perry, a Pentecostal minister with a history of anguished soul-searching and outright despair over the conflict that he had been led to believe existed at the intersection of his sexuality and faith, is the founder of the MCC Church. You may know this name, Troy Perry. Perry eventually did come to understand that he wasn't to divorce his sexuality and faith, but to hold them together. And there were very little, well, there were probably no real examples to him of openly gay pastors at the time. So think about the imagination of possibilities beyond what he thought was possible that had to go into making him who he was. There were no examples for him to look to as an openly gay pastor. And his call was to minister with gays and lesbians marginalized by their faith communities. So this is what he did. He put an ad in the Advocate magazine for a worship service that he would hold in his living room in LA. And Perry gathered 12 people on October 6, 1968. And this was the first service of worship that would grow to become the Metropolitan Community Church. And I have to say this, if for those who have been around and involved in churches that were becoming affirming, waiting on our turn to receive the blessing, being patient, hoping to be let in someday, was not working anymore. Perry thought that this little worship gathering that he had started would last about 2 years. This was his plan, before all the mainline denominations would come around on LGBTQ inclusion. Hopeful imagination about possibilities. I mean, really, 2 years, he thought, we'll give it, and the denominations will all come around. Well, the mainline churches were exercising patience, of course, on the inclusion of LGBT people, while the MCC church grew to become the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history. The first building ever owned by a gay organization wasn't a community center or an office for lobbyists or a facility for activists. It was a church. The permanent sanctuary built by the MCC church in the 70s. And we're at risk of losing the stories of our queer and trans ancestors in the faith at a time when we need them most to help us get through the coming days. These stories remind us that following Jesus costs us something. And that's a crux of the gospel message. And it's a truth that queer and trans followers of Christ get in our bones. Imagining uncertain possibilities beyond the restricting dictates of the present status quo is a gift that queer and trans people bring to congregations. And Perry and the early MCC church embodied this anticipatory view of possibility, uncertainty, but imagination toward possibilities that could come into being. And they also embody another critical piece on the hope wheel, the cultivation of community when the mechanisms of domination and oppression seek to tear us apart. Many years ago at a Cooperative Baptist Fellowship General Assembly, there's a South African minister named Trevor Hudson. And he said something that has stuck with me for well over a decade now. This was probably almost 15 years ago. And I think about this quote probably weekly. I don't remember anything else that happened at this assembly, but I remember this one sentence. Hudson said, "Disorganized good is no match for organized evil." Disorganized good is no match for organized evil. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is where the terms like collective efficacy comes in. Our belief that we can act together and be effective. This is why you need to resurrect the stories of your courage and risk and your effectiveness in the past in your communities, because they say something about your capacity today. We need to believe that we can be effective in some things that we do together. It's an important factor in promoting advocacy and action within communities. We know this from research on climate change activists. But that does not come from simply being together. Just getting together every Sunday or whenever you get together doesn't produce collective efficacy. It doesn't even really produce community. Community must be cultivated, says the professor of congregational and community care leadership. I actually think this needs to be taught well. By practicing our action in community together over time, we build collective efficacy. Attending to the textures of communal identity and the forces that keep us together against the forces that seek to tear us apart. I want to tell another story here from someone else's. This is just a little image I wanted to give you that I'm not going to spend time on, but if you'd like more on this, this is how I image community for my students and for a lot of congregations I talk to, that we need to think about our life in the world somewhere there in the middle, where we're cultivating a sense of belonging to God, the transcendence dimension, a belonging to one another, the togetherness dimension, and a belonging to the wider web of life, the tethering dimension. And there are a lot of forces that are pulling these three apart all the time, but our communal practices need to be attending to helping keep us right there with these three things together. Email me if you want more on that. But let me get to this story. In his 2024 book, Hope for Cynics, which I recommend to you, Stanford psychologist and neuroscientist Jamil Zaki tells the story of two nearly identical neighborhoods in Kobe, Japan. The neighborhoods were called Mano and Mikura. They were barely 3 miles apart, both dense with factories, workshops, and houses, both home to aging middle and working class populations. But there were a few differences between these communities, too. They were identical in most ways, but Mano was full of small family businesses, relying on trade between neighbors, where women played an integral role in the economy, and Makura was more patriarchal. Mano also had a history of facing challenges together. In the 1960s, when factories were poisoning the air and 40% of residents were suffering from asthma, and public services like garbage collection lapsed, the neighborhood of Mano was being given over to rats, flies, mosquitoes. The population of the neighborhood began to fall, but then the residents fought back. They created a local planning committee, and they pressured the government for resources and anti-pollution efforts. Parks started to appear between crowded streets, factories relocated, trash was collected, quality of life improved. The neighborhood of Makura, however, had never had a history of hardship and banding together in a common cause like this. So in 1995, when a massive earthquake hit the city of Kobe, fires erupted all across the city and the surrounding area and lasted 2 days. 2 days of fires, killing over 5,000 people and destroying more than 100,000 buildings. And that's when the histories of these two neighborhoods become really interesting. Zaki says the Makurians watched, many in their night clothes, while homes turned to ash. Mano residents didn't wait for the authorities, but leapt into action together, forming pop-up bucket brigades, grabbing hoses from factories, pumping water from rivers to fight the fire. About 1 in every 4 Mano homes were ruined, but almost 3 out of every 4 were destroyed in Makura. Makura's rate of death was 10 times higher than Mano's. And in the aftermath, Mano formed relief organizations, collected signatures to build temporary housing, and set up makeshift daycares. Makura didn't coordinate, and they lost out on public services. Zaki sums up the differences between these nearly identical neighborhoods in the city, saying, quote, "Around the world, connections between people predict how well towns and cities bounce back from tsunamis, storms, and attacks. Networks of faith, community, and solidarity pivot in times of need, remaining agile and hardy. When communities lose trust, they grow unstable, like a Jenga tower with the bottom block knocked out. But communities of hopeful practice don't start in an emergency. Mano had a history of coming together to address hardships with one another. They had built the capacities that they needed that came into play in an emergency. There's a great example actually from my own neighborhood back in Boston, neighborhood of Jamaica Plain. One day, that's me in the pink shirt there. One day I was getting out of my car after coming home from church, and this guy in the white shirt was taking a jog, and he said, "Hey, you want to come to my garage on Thursday or whenever and watch the presidential debate?" I was like, "Oh, okay." So I showed up. I'd never met this guy. His name is Matt Schumann. So that was the first gathering of what became known as the Wenham Street Cinema. After that, every month he invited the whole neighborhood to come to his garage, and sometimes they'd play a children's movie. Sometimes they'd play a movie for adults. They would always have food. People would bring food and share with one another. He would have local politicians come and talk to the neighborhood in his garage. When people were running for, city council for our area, he'd have them come and talk to the neighborhood in his garage. When the next election came around, we watched the presidential debates in his garage. I didn't know anyone in this neighborhood other than the people that lived upstairs and downstairs from me in my apartment, until Matt Schumann started this little gathering in his garage before the pandemic, which was really essential, because then during the pandemic, when we were all shut in our houses, it felt less isolating because I knew the people who lived around me. So this is just a really nice example of someone who is doing something on a small scale to begin building community in his neighborhood. And this, if you want to take a photo or get that QR code, It'll take you to a website where you can listen to house calls. Anyone listen to the podcast House Calls? It was the podcast of the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. If you are a leader in a faith community, pastor or lay person, you need to listen to this podcast, not just this episode, the whole thing. Every episode is about building the textures of community, about helping people who are struggling through the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And this story is about a gathering called Neighbor's Table, where a woman started inviting people to her backyard for a meal in her neighborhood. And it became such an essential part of their literal neighborhood community that people started asking her if they could have their weddings in her backyard and things like that, because this was a gathering place for people, and she tells that story in this podcast episode. I really would love for you to listen to that. All right, next piece of the hope wheel, mourning and lament. To love the world right now means that you must be able to mourn it. Mourning and lament move beyond the feeling of an expression of our grief over all that we are losing into enacting that grief in practices of mourning and lament. It's really important to be able to feel the grief, to express the grief. But this is the gift of churches again. We know how to hold in community the grief that we experience, to ritualize it, to mourn it. Even in a place like Harvard University, where I was a chaplain for several years, when there was a death on campus, these are the smartest people in the world. They did not know what to do with 200 students in a room until the chaplain showed up. Because we knew how to do something about this with 200 people together in a room. And they were, like the most brilliant economist who was the, faculty dean of this house, could say kind things to his students. The counseling services came and gave them information about how they could come to therapy, in the coming weeks if they needed to. But no one knew how to hold this grief and mourning in a community of 200 or 300 people, except people who are trained to lead congregations. You have gifts that you don't realize are gifts, I think. In her 2025 book, Hopeful Pessimism, philosopher Mara van der Lugt makes the case saying that in an age when entire islands are sinking into the sea, vast stretches of land and wood are swept away by storms or wind or fire, and cities by floods, when we are losing species more quickly than we can count them, and people young and old stand weeping in the streets, it is crucial that all of us living through these times are able to express freely and sincerely our beliefs and attitudes, even and perhaps especially when those moods are dark. The insistence on positive, optimistic, hopeful narratives comes with its own risks and burdens, whereas the repression of negative, pessimistic, and even desperate counter-narratives is truly dangerous, as it charges the already burdened with the duty of optimism. And one more quote from a human environment relations geographer named Leslie Head. She says, the evidence is mounting that we are well past the point where climate change response can be a planned gradual transition. We need to deal with at least the possibility of catastrophe. Yet daily life continues more or less unchanged in varying combinations of struggle and contentment. We are in collective denial. We are grieving. Enacting our mourning and lament in community resists the constant drive toward optimism and progress that keep us from turning aside to attend to the places of death in the world that cry out for our attention. Mexican psychologist Jorge Mendoza Garcia argues that institutions work to erase memory for exactly this purpose. Progress that is rooted in power has no memory. So forgetfulness is cultivated through silence, distance, and absences. This requires the attending practice of what narrative therapists call remembering, re-membering, putting our lives back together again with those we've lost along the way. Those who are distanced from us in geography, but must be kept close to us in our grief and mourning and lament. And I often hear pastors and church folks talk about being people of resurrection hope. But you don't get to resurrection except through the places of execution and death. Hope comes from traveling through hell, forging relationships of deep solidarity along the way, and finding a way out together, all the while mourning those that you've lost along the way. Yet almost across the board, all of my students claim that they've never seen rituals and practices of mourning and lament in their congregation, outside of funerals. No collective act. They don't know what lament even looks like in a congregation. They've never seen it. Here's an example. The picture is not the example of what I'm going to read, but it's relevant. You know this story. 18-year-old Michael Brown stood on the streets of his family's neighborhood in Ferguson, Missouri, hands raised in the air before being fatally shot 6 times by a Ferguson police officer, and his body laid on the sweltering August streets in view of his friends and neighbors. And Brown's grandmother came upon the scene looking for her grandson who had been on his way to visit her. In the gathering of family and friends and neighbors that grew on the street that day, before 3 waves of protest that roiled through the following summer, something vitally important happened. Michael Brown's community stayed with his body. Pastoral theologian Shaniqua Walker Barnes describes the impromptu vigil that developed on the streets of Ferguson that day, saying, quietly, they watched as the coroner's office finally showed up at the scene. Then when Michael's body had been loaded onto the coroner's van, they followed, walking en masse to the police department. There, too, they waited calmly for someone to come out and explain why Brown had been shot when, as the word had already spread, his hands had been up. Their somber poses, their insistence on staying with the body, their demands for accountability for Brown's killing, Walker Barnes says, was a historic African-American mourning ritual. Through their actions, their closeness to Brown's body, even in death, his community responded to what Cara Holloway identifies as the central question of African-American mourning: who's got the body? The police, however, took their presence and their insistence on staying with his body, their calls for accountability and information as a threat, and responded with militarized force and a curfew. The national reckoning that surrounded Brown's killing by police in Ferguson was historic, but it was Brown's dead body that became the site of mourning and lament and a striving toward accountability for justice. It was his body that the crowds followed that day before the streets of Ferguson were filled with protesters from all over the country. His community followed him, as in funeral processions of old, through the streets of the city as he traveled in a coroner's van to the morgue. Brown's community stayed with his body. They insisted his body mattered, even in death. The connection to the corpses of black bodies killed through acts of violence and a community of mourning, lament, and striving toward justice has had a lengthy history. We might recall the tenacity of Mamie Till Mobley, who, when she saw the body of her son, Emmett Till, after he'd been murdered and mutilated and thrown into the Tallahatchie River in an act of racist violence, insisted that the country look upon his corpse. The funeral director strongly recommended to her a closed casket funeral, but Mamie Till Mobley refused and insisted the casket be open and photographs taken, saying, "Let the people see what they did to my boy." In refusal to look away from the bodies of their dead or to have those bodies too quickly taken from their accompaniment, the community of Michael Brown, the mother of Emmett Till, many other African American communities have stayed with the bodies of their beloved ones taken in acts of violence and insisted that the country see not just injustice and violence in the abstract, but the bodies of their dead. This is mourning and lament as a part of hopeful practice. Another, taking into account the more than human web of life. In August 2019, Iceland marked the first ever loss of an entire glacier to climate change with a funeral held on the barren landscape that was once covered in ice. The OK Glacier, I'm sure it's pronounced some other way in Icelandic, but I don't know what that way is. They were grieved by the fact that this glacier that had been part of their community, something that they related to daily, was now gone, with a grave sense of finality. And on that site, at this funerary gathering, they placed a bronze plaque that contains a letter to the future that reads, "OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it." In our despair over climate collapse, in the desperation that many of our communities of faith feel to do something that might make a meaningful difference for the survivability of the interwoven tapestry of life on this planet, even in our most depressed and despondent and dejected states when nothing seems to be making a difference and nothing else seems to matter, we would do well to take the advice of Job, sitting in the ashes of his own life, who knew despair, desperation, depression, despondency, dejection, more than any other figure in the long communion of saints. And his advice was very simple. Job said, "Speak to the earth." Most of our Christian communities have lost our capacity to speak to the earth, to treat the earth as co-worshipers of the glory of God, to treat the ecological communion as companions in our life. Two other brief examples. I'm not going to tell stories of these. In 2018, my congregation back in Cambridge was obviously very concerned about mass shootings. And we decided to erect a 7-foot tall cross on the front lawn of the church. And each month we stamped with hammered letters the city and state and number dead of every mass shooting in the country, and then we nailed them to this cross. There was a sign down below it. Thousands of people walk by this church every single day. This was a public expression of lament, that combination of grief and anger about the mass shootings in our country. Another example, in the first Trump administration, several children who died very early on in ICE detention. We did not want their names and their stories to be forgotten. We put their pictures, their names, their ages, where they were from, on lawn signs on the front lawn of the church that was up for months so that passersby would not forget these children. It's public mourning and lament. Grief may not look a whole lot like hope to you, but if you're not grieving in community, all that we are losing, including the rapidly vanishing species we share life with on this planet, then your hope is likely not rooted in the reality of the wild world we live in. Grief keeps our hearts tender to all that is breaking while not allowing our own hearts to break completely in the process. Grief, mourning, lament gives elasticity to hope. Grieving together is hoping together. The last piece of the hope wheel here, care practice. Pay careful attention to the word praxis here. This is not a sentiment or feeling of care, though care may begin that way. This is about putting our care and concern for the well-being of others, the ethical singularity of every life, into practices that contribute toward the flourishing of others, even others who aren't in close proximity to us, even others of other species. I'm a professor of care, so I could spend another hour here on this piece of the wheel, but you can also pick up spiritual care first aid after this, where you can read a lot of my thoughts about how to practice care in communities in very practical ways. So instead, I just want to illustrate what caring praxis looks like with a story that illustrates care as well as any other story I know. And it illustrates just how dangerous caring praxis is to the powers that need some populations to be disposable. You probably know the names Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They were the founders of the Black Panther Party in 1966. Their first program was the Free Breakfast for Children program, When many poor black children couldn't learn in school because they were going on an empty stomach, their community organized in caring practice. And in 1968, the Black Panthers set up at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland, partnering with the priest there, who I recently learned before moving to Oakland was a priest in St. Paul, Minnesota. And a couple months ago, I met a lot of his now elderly, but at the time young parishioners who, when I told this story, not knowing that they were in the room, said, "That was our pastor." I was like, wow. I'm like, wow. So St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland partnered with the priest and some parishioners and some neighborhood mothers to feed children for free before they went to school. By the end of the year, there were 23 chapters all across the country, cities all across the country, feeding more than 20,000 children for free. This is, of course, Newton and Seal, and then that's the pastor there, Earl Neal. When the National School Lunch Program administrator was called before the U.S. Senate and questioned on the matter, he admitted that the Black Panthers fed more poor children than the whole state of California did. But J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, said that the Panthers were the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. It wasn't because they had too many guns or planned to attack something or made threats to government officials. It was because of the free breakfast program that they were considered a threat to national security. And Hoover authorized the FBI's attempt to destroy the program by forging letters to stores, discouraging them from donating food, and spreading rumors in the communities that the food was poisoned, and even raiding the breakfast program sites while the children ate. This is organized abandonment and the criminalization of care. Don't forget these stories. This is happening now. They're happening all over the country as we sit here. But in the end, the state couldn't win this fight, so it subsumed the program with Congress's increase of funding to the National School Lunch Program so that poor children could eat for free. Now in Minnesota, every child eats for free, period. And we owe it to the Black Panthers. And a bunch of neighborhood mothers, and a church and pastor, and some congregants who got together and practiced care for their community, and who stood up to the FBI in order to engage in rebellious acts of care for one another. All right, I'm wrapping up. Well, you can't really read this, but these are some of the things that I think if we don't attend to each of these pieces of the wheel are threats to the practice of hope. Apathy, immobilization if we don't attend to care practice, turning away from suffering if we're not actively mourning and lamenting, cynicism, turning inward if we're not cultivating community, etc. And if you want to divide these up, I'd say this left-hand side is what we might call pastoral tasks. The right-hand side is what we might call prophetic tasks. But the hope wheel doesn't work unless both of these are happening. These are books that I think you should read. The top here, Hope Draped in Black, Spirit of Hope, and Radical Hope are a little more philosophical and kind of, especially Hope Draped in Black, very academic. I think you'd find all three of these pretty academic. Centering Hope, I've quoted from this several times, Yara Gonzalez Sustiano. She's a really wonderful pastoral theologian at Vanderbilt. I think you'd like her book. It's rooted in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and research she did. And then every single one of you, if you are involved in a community of faith or a community of any kind that is trying to practice hope and care and justice, you need to read Let This Radicalize You by Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba. They are experienced organizers who tell stories that you need to hear and have practical advice for how you as a community can be responding helpfully in the time in which we live. So if you don't get any of these other books or mine later, get Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba's book, Let This Radicalize You. So here's the invitation I want to leave you with. So just a brief summary here of what I hope that you're going away with. Hope is not found, it is cultivated. Hope is not a possession, it is a practice. The opposite of hope is not found in despair or pessimism, but in certainty and indifference. Despair and pessimism can be what give hope rise. Certainty and indifference are the enemies of hope. And just like faith must be formed and love must be put into action, hope too must be learned and honed and taught and grown. And we need communities serious about hope now more than ever. Since I've been working at Luther Seminary the last couple of years as their token Baptist, I've been getting into Lutheran theologians, and one of my favorites, the person I've been reading probably the most on and off for the last few years, is a man named Ernst Käsemann. Do you all know this name? He was a member of the Confessing Church who voted for Hitler because he wanted order in Germany, then very soon realized the mistake he had made and became a leader in the Confessing Church movement to oppose Hitler, and also became a really famous New Testament theologian. But here's what Käsemann says. None are ineligible or superfluous. None sit idly and without responsibility. All are sent for this attack of grace on the cosmos in its most hidden nooks and crannies. This is the order of the church as the body of Christ, which truly never sanctions the status quo. So, let the attack of grace on the cosmos commence.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. I neglected to mention something earlier, and that is that Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, now known as BSK, has co-sponsored this event, and we are grateful for their support. Their president and, I guess, First Lady, the real First Lady, are in the room with us, Dr. David Cassidy. So thank you so much. We're going to break now for 45 minutes. Someone will direct you down the hall to our Birchwood lobby, where you'll find an assortment of snacks and beverages, as well as Carmichael's bookstore set up down there, selling books from some of our speakers, panelists today, and you'll be able to get your copy and get it inscribed if you wish. Excuse me. We will reconvene back here, but we'll announce when we're ready to do that. Thank you very much.